For the last 4 weeks, as we have walked in the footsteps of Jesus, we have run into some interesting people along the way. On the first Sunday of Lent, we ran into Satan, who tested Jesus. On the second, Nicodemus, who questioned Jesus. On the third, a Samaritan woman who believed Jesus. And today, a formerly blind man sees Jesus more clearly than those who had had their sight their whole lives. It's been an interesting Lenten journey so far, at least for me. When we began this Lenten preaching series about walking the pathway between mountain and cross, I thought I knew what it would be like. Let's face it, this isn't my first Lent. As in previous Lents, I expected to find myself challenged to perform acts of service and faith demonstrating my commitment to Christ. I expected to be challenged to make a sacrifice worthy of the one Jesus would make for me. And I would witness how Jesus brought grace to those he encountered so that I might do the same. As I began to reflect back after last week's preaching group, I got excited. I felt like I was facing a different challenge this year. I felt like I was seeing something along that pathway I had not seen before. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that instead of facing different challenges, I was simply facing the same challenges differently. As I asked myself why this conundrum, I realized that it was because in the past, during previous Lenten journeys, my focus has typically been on me and my experience of Lent, or us and our shared experience. This Lent, I've tried to live into our Lenten challenge to keep my focus on Christ. And in doing so, I have seen that what we think we understand, what we think we hear and believe, what we think we see is limited. It is limited by the lens we look at life through. Add to this, when that lens is us, it's much less than perfect. And therefore everything we see is even further distorted. But when we use the lens of Jesus, we see things much more clearly. And what we see is amazing. So amazing that Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, tells us that when our focus is on ourselves, no eye can see, no ear can hear, no mind can imagine what God has in store for those who love him. But when our focus is on Jesus, all this, he says, and more will be revealed. And we just may find ourselves overwhelmed by the grace we find before us, the grace that we find within us, and the grace God offers through us. It's kind of like the mission trip our youth took a couple of years ago to the Dominican Republic. We went there with this expectation of clearing land and planting a garden. And we did. Just not the garden we had envisioned. At least in my mind, I pictured vegetables and greens. Instead, we planted 200 citrus trees. What our group had envisioned, while admirable, met a short-term need that would require much effort to maintain year in and year out. What God had intended was much more long-term. Those trees we planted will offer that community fresh fruit for many years to come and require much less work than any vegetable garden would maintain. Like God's love for us, like God's grace, they are gifts that keep on giving. Unfortunately, we don't always recognize it when we first encounter it. It's only when we look back, when we look in that rearview mirror, that it begins to all make sense. And then all of a sudden, just like Emerald Lagasse says, bam! We get it. We get it. And from that moment on, we can't help but see it. And as a result, our lives, like the lives of Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, the blind man, are forever changed. If we're lucky, that happens sooner in life than later. But I'd like to think that we are not limited by our inability to look beyond ourselves in this life, and that there is hope for us in the next. Hope like we found along with the people we met on the journey as we read through Mitch Albom's book, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, or C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. People who reveal more about us, more about our relationship to and with Christ than maybe we even knew or were willing to admit. One thing we learned from those book studies, and we see again in the lessons that we've been reading this Lent, is that people matter. And not only the people whom we like or who we agree with, but all those other people too. Those who would strive to steer us in the wrong direction. Those who would like to frustrate us with their endless questions. Those like the Pharisees in today's gospel who just don't get it. We might walk away from people like that. Sometimes gladly. But Jesus, we've seen in the gospel this entire Lent, will not walk away from them. Why? Because people matter. Jesus hopes that all will know, all will believe, all will see the abundance of grace God offers in and through him. That he now offers in and through us. And through those we encounter along our journey. Now here's a teaser for Elisa's sermon next week. We still have one more person to meet. In the meantime, what makes the Lenten challenges we face this year different is that the acts of service and faith, once expected, are less about doing and more about being. Walking with Jesus, we see that it is about being true to who we are and being present for those we encounter along the way so that we may know their pain, their suffering, their worries. The sacrifice we make is not one of penitence. It's one of joy. Instead of holding on to those things that constantly remind us we are unworthy of God's love, we set them aside. We put them down. We unload those things that grieve us and grieve God, so that we may know that love, that we may accept that gift of grace that God so freely offers. And how might we help others to know that grace that we have received? Not by sitting in the pews on Sunday morning. Not waiting for them to come to us. One of the things that our Lenten journey has shown us is that Jesus didn't sit in one place waiting for people to come to him. He took the good news to them. And when they listened in faith, they welcomed it. Their lives were changed, and they went out and shared it with others. Of course, we've also seen not everybody buys what Jesus is selling. But as we've seen, Jesus didn't stand there and argue with Satan to try to convince him. He doesn't let rejection in one place keep him from trying in another. Therefore, like Jesus, we need to be on the move. We need to be out there, outside the four walls of our parish, sharing the good news with others. Some will shun us. Some will look down their nose at us. Some will even think we're crazy. So what? Move on. Find someone else and try again. Last week I closed by encouraging us, those of us uncertain about how we respond, what we say when we are asked about how that good news matters in our lives. I encourage us to just listen. Listen for and to what Jesus is trying to tell us. This week, I'm asking us to share what we learned with at least one person. Now, I know I've asked you that before. I know it's hard. I know it's scary. So start out easy. Start out with a loved one, a friend, fellow believer. Get comfortable using the words, hearing the words, and don't be afraid. Do not be afraid to try sharing it with someone who we think needs to hear it. We might be surprised. The person who seems the most out there, the most unlikely, or the most unwilling to listen to what we have to say, might be the one person waiting, needing to hear what we have.